Still remember the thunder of my father's voice as he banished me from the only home I'd ever known. Pregnant, terrified, and utterly alone, I walked through those castle gates with nothing but the clothes on my back and the unborn child beneath my heart. My crime? Loving a common blacksmith instead of the prince my father had chosen for me. What I couldn't know then, as rain soaked through my silk slippers and tears blurred my vision, was that my son would be born with a gift so extraordinary it would bridge the chasm between a broken king and his exiled daughter. For 5 years, I built a new life among the common folk, learning what it truly means to survive, to struggle, to love without the protection of castle walls. And then, one morning, my silent child looked up at me with ancient eyes and spoke his first words. "I need to see grandfather. I hear him crying at night." How could my 5-year-old son, who had never set foot in the castle, know the sound of a king's sorrow? And why, when we finally returned to face the man who had cast us out, did my father fall to his knees at the sight of my child, whispering, "It was you all along"? The screams echoed through the great hall like thunder, bouncing off ancient stone walls that had witnessed generations of royal decrees. Princess Isolde stood trembling before her father, King Aldemar, her slender fingers instinctively cradling the barely visible swell of her belly. At 19 years old, her porcelain face, once the pride of the kingdom, was now streaked with tears, her golden hair falling in disarray around her shoulders. The royal council members lined the walls, their eyes fixed on the floor in uncomfortable silence. Not one dared to meet the princess's desperate gaze. Even the queen, Isolde's own mother, had covered her face with her hands, unable to witness the public humiliation of her only daughter. "You have dishonored royal blood, Isolde." King Aldemar's voice boomed through the hall. Each word spat like venom from his lips. His face had turned crimson with rage, veins pulsing at his temples beneath his golden crown. "You carry the child of a common blacksmith, a man who hammers iron for copper coins." Isolde's lips quivered as she attempted to speak. "Father, please, silence!" The king slammed his fist against the throne's armrest, the sound cracking through the air like a whip. "You were promised to Prince Edmund of Northumbria, a union that would have secured our borders for generations, and you throw it all away for what? The embrace of a filthy commoner?" The morning had begun so differently. Just hours before this public disgrace, Isolde had rushed to her father's private chambers, hope still flickering in her heart. Her mother had advised her to approach him alone, away from the prying eyes of the court. Perhaps in solitude, the king's heart might soften toward his only daughter. She had knelt before him, tears welling in her eyes as she spoke of Liam, the blacksmith who treated her with dignity and respect when courtiers only saw her title. How his hands, though rough with calluses, touched her with gentleness she had never known. How, when she visited the village in disguise, he had spoken to her as a woman, not as a princess to be bartered for political advantage. "I do not wish for the crown, father," she had pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Only for the right to love." The king's face had hardened into stone. In that moment, Isolde realized a terrible truth. In this world of crowns and castles, true love was worth less than the title one carried. The king had not even allowed her to finish speaking before summoning the guards. Now, standing before the entire court, Isolde felt the weight of her father's judgment crushing her. No defense was permitted, no mercy would be shown. The sentence had been decided before she entered the hall. "By royal decree," King Aldemar announced, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth, "Princess Isolde is hereby banished from the kingdom. She will leave tonight, taking nothing but what she can carry." Gasps rippled through the hall. Banishment was a sentence reserved for traitors and murderers, not for princesses whose only crime was loving beneath their station. "My lord," the royal advisor cautiously stepped forward, perhaps a more lenient. "She has made her choice." The king's voice silenced all opposition. "Let her live with the consequences." As the rain sliced through the cold night air, Isolde was escorted beyond the castle gates. No carriage was provided. No servant allowed to accompany her. They gave her only a woolen cloak against the bitter wind and a small sack of coins that would barely last a month. The guards, men who had once bowed to her every morning, now avoided her eyes as they closed the massive wooden gates behind her. The castle, once her home and sanctuary, now loomed against the stormy sky like a mausoleum. Torchlight from the towers cast long shadows across the muddy road, illuminating her solitary figure as she took her first steps into exile. The child within her, the reason for her banishment, stirred, as if sensing the gravity of their situation. Isolde pulled the hood of her cloak lower against the driving rain and turned toward the stone village that lay in the valley below. In her 19 years, she had never walked this road alone. She had never known true hunger, true cold, true fear. Now, as thunder rolled across the darkened hills, she realized her greatest suffering had only just begun. The rain plastered her hair to her face, mingling with tears she could no longer distinguish from the downpour. Her silk slippers, unsuitable for travel, sank into the mud with each step. By morning, the princess who had never known hardship would arrive at the village gates looking like any other desperate traveler seeking shelter. As Isolde descended the winding path toward her uncertain future, she did not notice the solitary figure watching from the highest tower of the castle. A silhouette framed against flickering candlelight, observing her departure with an expression that betrayed neither triumph nor pity, only calculated interest. And this figure was not the king. Dawn broke reluctantly over the village of Eldrath, a sprawling collection of timber and stone hovels nestled in the valley below the king's castle. The morning light revealed muddy streets where pigs roamed freely between puddles, and the mingled scents of coal fire, freshly baked bread, and human waste hung in the air like a tangible fog. Isolde stood at the village entrance, her once fine cloak now sodden and caked with mud. The night's journey had left her exhausted, her silk slippers torn beyond repair, and her golden hair, once the pride of the royal court, hung in wet, tangled ropes around her pale face. Without her crown or royal guards, she was unrecognizable as the princess who had been the subject of ballads and paintings throughout the kingdom. "Move along, beggar," a burly merchant barked as he pushed past her with a cart of turnips. "Market Square's no place for your kind to loiter." Beggar. The word struck Isolde like a physical blow. Just yesterday, this same man would have bowed so low his forehead might have touched the ground at the mere sight of her. Today, she was invisible, or worse, an inconvenience to be shooed away like a stray dog. She clutched her small sack of coins tighter, suddenly aware of how quickly even this meager fortune could be stolen. The village streets bustled with morning activity, bakers shouting the day's prices, children chasing chickens between market stalls, and women balancing water jugs on sturdy hips. No one spared her a second glance. Isolde approached a tavern keeper who was throwing buckets of dirty water onto the street. "Pardon me," she said, her royal accent still evident despite her bedraggled appearance. "I seek lodging. I can pay." The woman looked her up and down with suspicious eyes. "We don't need your kind of trouble here. Palace guards came through last night asking about strange women. Said a criminal might be heading this way." Isolde's heart sank. Her father had been thorough, ensuring she would find no easy refuge even among commoners. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, where the smallest swell protected the future that had cost her everything. As the morning wore on, door after door closed in her face. By midday, hunger gnawed at her stomach, and the weight of desperation pressed down on her shoulders. She found herself in the poorest section of the village, where the houses leaned precariously against one another like drunken soldiers. "You look like you could use a warm fire, child." Isolde turned to find an elderly woman watching her from the doorway of a tiny cottage. The woman's face was a map of wrinkles, her back bent from decades of labor, but her eyes held a kindness Isolde hadn't seen since leaving the castle. "I can pay," Isolde said quickly, reaching for her coin pouch. The old woman waved her hand dismissively. "Put that away before someone sees it. Around here, coin purses have a way of disappearing faster than morning mist." She beckoned Isolde closer. "I'm Ava, and you are clearly not from Eldrath." Inside the cottage, a small fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls hung with bundles of drying herbs. The space was smaller than Isolde's dressing room at the castle, but it smelled of rosemary and fresh bread. "Sit," Ava instructed, pointing to a three-legged stool near the fire. You're soaked through. Isolde sank onto the stool gratefully, extending her trembling hands toward the flames. Why help me? Everyone else has turned me away. Eva placed a chipped clay mug of steaming liquid in Isolde's hands. Princess or not, every mother deserves shelter, she said simply, her weathered hand gently touching Isolde's stomach. Tears sprang to Isolde's eyes at the unexpected kindness. For the first time since her banishment, she allowed herself to weep openly. Not the silent tears of the throne room, but gut-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. The next morning, after sleeping on a straw pallet softer than she had expected, Isolde ventured out with a purpose. Liam's forge stood at the edge of the village. She had visited it in secret many times during her clandestine trips outside the castle. The familiar sound of hammer striking iron called to her like a beacon. But when she rounded the corner, the forge stood silent. The door hung open, tools scattered as if abandoned in haste. "Looking for the blacksmith?" a skinny boy asked, appearing suddenly at her side. "Royal guards took him 3 days ago. Said he dishonored nobility." The boy spat on the ground. "That's what happens when you reach above your station, my pa says." Isolde's knees gave way, and she sank to the mud-slicked street. Liam, imprisoned, because of her, because of them. The king had ordered his silence through pain, ensuring the father of her child could never come to her aid. "They keep him in the old prison tower," the boy continued, unaware of her anguish. "Some say they'll hang him when the moon is full." Tears blinded her as she stumbled back to Eva's cottage. She fell to her knees in the doorway, her whole body shaking with grief and rage. "They have him," she choked out. "My father imprisoned the man I love." Eva said nothing, simply holding Isolde as she had undoubtedly held countless others through their personal tragedies. When the worst of the tears had subsided, the old woman pressed a needle and thread into Isolde's hands. "Your hands are soft, but they'll toughen," she said firmly. "If you want to free your man, you'll need more than tears. You'll need coin and standing in this village." Over the following weeks, Isolde learned to sew. Her first attempts were clumsy, nothing like the delicate embroidery she had been taught at court. But she improved quickly, and soon local mothers were bringing their children's torn clothing to the new seamstress at Eva's cottage. Each stitch was an act of defiance. Each coin earned was a step toward Liam's freedom. The princess, who had never worked a day in her life, found calluses forming on her once perfect fingers. Slowly, the villagers' suspicion gave way to grudging respect. They still didn't know who she truly was. Isolde had given her name as Marla, but they recognized the determination in her eyes when she worked late into the night by candlelight. "You're gaining their trust," Eva observed one evening as they shared a simple meal of bread and thin soup. "That's more valuable than gold in times like these." Isolde nodded, her hand resting on her growing belly. 4 months had passed since her banishment, and her condition was now impossible to hide. Yet strangely, her pregnancy seemed to endear her further to the village women, who brought her remedies for morning sickness and extra blankets for the coming winter. Then came the morning when a child no older than 7 knocked on their door, clutching a folded parchment. "A man in a brown cloak paid me 2 coppers to bring this to the pregnant seamstress," the child announced proudly. Isolde took the parchment with trembling fingers. When she unfolded it, her blood ran cold. There, stamped in wax, was her father's royal seal, the crowned eagle she had known all her life. The message was brief, written in a hand she didn't recognize. "Your child does not belong to you. Come to the monastery before the full moon. By order of the king." Winter had settled over Eldrath when Isolde's time came. The bitter cold had driven villagers indoors, leaving the narrow streets deserted, save for the occasional desperate soul hurrying between shelters. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, muffling the sounds of the world and turning the landscape into a blank canvas of white. Isolde had ignored the king's message. Instead, she had fled further from the castle with Eva's help, traveling under cover of night to a neighboring village where her father's influence was weaker. There, they found shelter in an abandoned stable at the edge of town, a humble place of splintered wood and moldy hay, but far from prying eyes. When the first pains struck, Isolde bit down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming. Eva worked quickly, hanging threadbare blankets over the stable entrance and lighting a small fire in a rusted brazier. The flames cast long, dancing shadows against the walls as Isolde's labor progressed through the endless night. "Breathe, child," Eva whispered, her weathered hands steady as she wiped sweat from Isolde's brow. "Your body knows what to do." Outside, an owl called into the darkness, a lone witness to the princess's suffering. Isolde's knuckles turned white as she gripped the edges of the straw pallet, her royal upbringing offering no preparation for this most primal of experiences. Hours blended together in a fog of pain as the stable filled with the scent of sweat, blood, and fear. Near dawn, when the first hints of light crept through the cracks in the stable walls, Isolde gave one final guttural push. The silence that followed lasted only seconds before being broken by a thin, reedy cry. The first breath of a new life entering the world. "A boy," Eva announced, wrapping the tiny, red-faced infant in a clean cloth. Small but strong. Isolde reached for her son with trembling arms. The child was indeed small, alarmingly so, with translucent skin that showed the blue tracery of veins beneath. But his eyes, when they opened briefly, seemed to contain depths far beyond those of a newborn. They were Liam's eyes, dark and fathomless, like forest pools on a moonless night. "Elric," Isolde whispered, the name coming to her lips unbidden. "His name is Elric." Eva nodded approvingly. A strong name for a child born in exile. For the first weeks of Elric's life, Isolde barely slept. Every sound outside their hiding place sent her heart racing with fear that her father's men had found them. The king's threat in that mysterious message haunted her dreams. "Your child does not belong to you." She kept Elric tucked against her chest day and night, as if her embrace alone could shield him from the world that had rejected them both. As winter gave way to spring, they established a tentative new life. Isolde continued her sewing, though now she worked with Elric sleeping beside her, his tiny fists occasionally twitching in dreams she could not share. The villagers accepted the story Eva had crafted, that Isolde was her widowed niece, her husband lost to fever before the child's birth. "Keep to yourself," Eva had advised. "The less they know of you, the safer you'll be." Isolde followed this counsel faithfully, declining invitations to village gatherings and keeping conversations brief when customers came to collect their mended garments. She told Elric stories of his father in whispered tones as she nursed him, tales of Liam's gentle strength, his clever hands, and the love that had cost them everything. But as the months passed, a worrying pattern emerged. While Elric grew physically, his limbs lengthening and his body filling out, he remained unnervingly silent. No babbling, no infant laughter, not even the frustrated cries typical of babyhood. He watched the world with those profound eyes, taking everything in but offering nothing in return. "He's like an old soul," Eva observed as they watched Elric studying the movement of dust motes in a beam of sunlight, as if he's seen too much already. By his first birthday, marked only by a small honey cake shared in the privacy of their modest room, Elric had yet to make any significant sounds. Isolde's worry deepened into fear. Was this silence a judgment from the gods for her defiance? Had her royal blood somehow poisoned her child? Then came the monks. They appeared in the village marketplace one crisp autumn morning. 3 figures in brown robes, their cowls hiding their faces as they moved among the stalls. They asked no direct questions, but their presence sent ripples of unease through the small community. "They're looking for someone," the baker's wife whispered to Isolde as she wrapped a small loaf of bread. "A woman with a child. They've been to 3 villages already." That night, Isolde packed their meager belongings. "We need to move again," she told Eva, her hands shaking as she folded Elric's small garments. "They're getting closer." Eva, now moving more slowly with age, nodded gravely. "There's a village beyond the eastern forest. My cousin's daughter lives there. She'll take you in if you mention my name." They left before dawn, Elric wrapped tightly against Isolde's chest as they followed deer paths through the dense woodland. The journey took 3 days, during which they slept in hollowed trees and ate the hard bread and dried berries Eva had packed for them. Not once did Elric cry, even when rain soaked through his blankets or when hunger must have gnawed at his tiny stomach. The eastern village was smaller, poorer, built around a single well and a communal oven. Here, Isolde became simply the widow, a quiet woman who kept to herself and worked until her fingers bled to feed her silent child. She learned to card wool, to spin rough thread, and eventually to weave simple fabrics on a borrowed loom. The physical labor was punishing for a woman raised in luxury, but each evening, as she collapsed onto her pallet beside Elric's sleeping form, she felt a pride her royal upbringing had never taught her. Elric grew from infant to toddler, his steps becoming sure and his frame sturdy despite his difficult start in life. By the time he was 3, he had become his mother's shadow, following her movements with careful attention, helping in small ways by handing her tools or collecting fallen threads. Yet still, he did not speak. Perhaps he was touched by the birth trauma, suggested a traveling healer who passed through the village. The old man examined Elric with gentle fingers, checking his throat and ears before shaking his head. Or perhaps he simply has nothing yet that he wishes to say. But Isolde knew it was more than that. There was an awareness in Elric's eyes that unsettled even those who spent only moments in his presence. And there were the drawings. She first discovered them traced in the dirt beside their small garden, intricate patterns that no 3-year-old should have been able to conceive, let alone execute. Swirls and lines that looked eerily familiar, though she couldn't place why. Later, she found similar markings on scraps of parchment, created with charcoal sticks Elric had collected from the cooking fire. One evening, as she prepared their simple dinner, she recognized one of the patterns. It was the royal crest. Not the complete eagle seal, but elements of it, arranged in a way that would be meaningless to anyone who hadn't grown up seeing it embroidered on every tapestry in the castle. "Elric," she whispered, kneeling beside him as he drew. "Where did you see this?" The boy looked up at her, his dark eyes fathomless, and simply pointed to his own chest. That night, after Elric had fallen asleep, Isolde wept silently. 5 years had passed since her banishment. 5 years of hiding, of reinventing herself, of watching over her shoulder for her father's men. She had believed they were finally safe, finally forgotten by the world that had cast them out. But Elric's drawings suggested otherwise. Somehow her son carried the royal legacy within him, a connection to a past she had tried desperately to leave behind. As the first light of dawn filtered through their small window, Isolde heard movement. Elric was awake, standing at the foot of her bed watching her with those ancient eyes. "Mama," he said, his voice clear and unchildlike in the quiet room. It was the first word he had ever spoken. Isolde sat up, her heart racing. "Elric, you can speak?" The boy nodded solemnly. "I need to see grandfather," he said, each word perfectly formed. "He is sad. I hear him crying at night." The capital city looked both familiar and foreign to Isolde as she approached its towering stone walls. 5 years had carved new lines into the landscape. Additional watchtowers dotted the perimeter, and the once vibrant banners that had hung from every battlement were now faded and tattered, dancing limply in the autumn breeze. She wore a simple brown cloak with a deep hood that shadowed her face. Beneath it, her golden hair, once her most recognizable feature, had been dyed a nondescript brown with walnut husks. Beside her walked Elric, his small hand clasped tightly in hers, his serious eyes taking in every detail of the city that should have been his birthright. "Remember," Isolde whispered as they approached the city gates, "your name is Edmund. I am Marla. We sell spices from the eastern provinces." Elric nodded solemnly. Since his first words 3 weeks ago, he had spoken sparingly, but with the vocabulary and clarity of someone much older. Each time he opened his mouth, Isolde felt a mixture of wonder and unease. The guards at the gate barely glanced at them, just another weather-worn woman and her quiet child, joining the steady stream of farmers, merchants, and travelers flowing into the capital for the autumn market. Inside the walls, the city's familiar chaos enveloped them. Street vendors shouting their wares, pigs and chickens darting between carts, the mingled scents of fresh bread, horse manure, and human sweat. "It smells angry," Elric said softly, his nose wrinkling. Isolde looked down at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "The city. It smells like people fighting." He pointed toward a group of thin-faced women arguing over the price of grain. Nearby, two men shoved each other over a disputed wagon space. Isolde listened more carefully to the conversations flowing around them. Fragments of worried talk reached her ears: poor harvests, higher taxes, villages abandoned. And everywhere, whispers about the king. Locked himself away. Listens to no one these days. The drought is a punishment from God. They made their way to the lower town market, where Isolde purchased a small sack of cinnamon and cloves, enough to maintain their cover story. As Elric examined a display of wooden toys, she carefully questioned the spice merchant. "We've traveled far," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "How fares the kingdom these days?" The merchant spat on the ground. "Poorly. 3 years of bad harvests. The king demands the same taxes whether the fields yield or not." He leaned closer. "They say he's gone mad with grief, lost his only daughter years ago and never recovered." Isolde's heart clenched. "The princess? I thought she was banished." "Aye, that's the tale, but some say she died in exile. Others say she lives as a witch in the northern forests." The merchant shrugged. "Either way, the king keeps her rooms untouched, writes her letters that never leave the castle." Letters. Her father was writing her letters. The thought pierced Isolde like a physical pain. They spent the day wandering the city, Isolde reacquainting herself with streets she had once traveled in royal carriages. Everything seemed smaller now, dirtier, or perhaps it was she who had changed, her eyes opened to the reality that had always existed beyond the castle walls. As dusk approached, they made their way to a small house in the tanner's district, where the pungent smell of curing hides kept property values low and visitors rare. Isolde knocked a specific pattern on the weathered door. A woman's voice called from within. "Who seeks shelter?" "A daughter of Eldrath," Isolde replied, using the phrase Ava had taught her. The door creaked open to reveal a woman in her 50s, her once pretty face now mapped with lines of hard living. For a moment, there was no recognition in her eyes. Then they widened. "By all the saints," she whispered. "Lady Isolde?" "Hello, Marta." Marta had been Isolde's personal maid from childhood until her banishment. Now, the former royal servant lived as a widow, supporting herself by taking in washing from more prosperous households. Her small home smelled of lye soap and damp linen. "I never thought to see you again in this life," Marta said, bustling to prepare a simple meal of bread and dried fish. Her eyes kept returning to Elric, who sat quietly observing everything. "And this is my son," Isolde said simply. Marta nodded, asking no further questions about the child's parentage. Instead, she shared what she knew of the castle, the gossip that filtered down from servants to former servants, creating an underground river of information. "The king is not well," she said, lowering her voice, though there was no one else to hear. "He trusts no one. The queen died 2 winters past, a wasting illness that took her slowly." Isolde closed her eyes briefly. Her mother, gone. Another loss she had not been permitted to mourn. "The barons grow restless," Marta continued. "They say the king's policies have driven the kingdom to ruin. Fields lie fallow because farmers cannot afford seed. Villages in the north have been abandoned entirely. And my father? How does he spend his days?" Marta's expression softened with pity. "He walks the battlements at night, they say, speaks to ghosts, writes letters that are never sent. The common folk whisper that the gods have cursed him for some terrible sin." That night, as Elric slept on a pallet near the hearth, Isolde stood at Marta's small window, gazing at the castle that loomed over the city. Somewhere within those walls was her father, the man who had cast her out, who had separated her from Liam, who had threatened to take her child. Yet Marta's words had painted a picture not of a tyrant, but of a broken man consumed by regret. "What do you intend to do?" Marta asked, joining her at the window. "I don't know," Isolde admitted. "Elric insisted we come. He says he hears my father crying." Marta glanced at the sleeping boy. "There's something unusual about him. A stillness that children his age shouldn't possess. He didn't speak a word until 3 weeks ago. Then he began talking in complete sentences, knowing things he couldn't possibly know." Isolde sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if he's truly mine, or if he belongs to some other world entirely." In the days that followed, Isolde established their routine. Each morning, they would venture to the market, where she sold small packets of spices and listened to the city's gossip. Elric never wandered far from her side, but his eyes constantly searched the crowds, as if looking for a specific face. One afternoon, as they walked past the castle's southern gate, Elric stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed on the guards standing watch. "What is it?" Isolde asked, alarmed by the intensity of his focus. "He's in there," Elric said. "The sad man. But he's not alone anymore. There are shadows around him." That night, Elric's sleep was restless. He tossed on his pallet, murmuring words Isolde couldn't understand. When he finally settled near dawn, she found him clutching something in his small fist, a scrap of parchment covered in the same strange symbols he had drawn in the dirt years before. The next day they heard whispers of a council meeting at the castle, barons from across the kingdom gathering to address the worsening drought and the king's increasingly erratic behavior. Isolde felt a chill of foreboding. If the nobles were openly challenging her father's authority, the kingdom stood on the edge of civil war. "We should leave," she told Marta that evening. "Return to the village before winter makes travel impossible." Marta nodded in agreement, but Elric shook his head firmly. "We can't go," he said. "Not yet. He needs to see us." That night, Isolde woke to find Elric's pallet empty. Panic seized her as she searched Marta's tiny home, calling his name in urgent whispers. The door stood slightly ajar, the night air seeping through the crack. She rushed into the darkened street, her heart pounding against her ribs. The cobblestones gleamed with recent rain, but there was no sign of her son's small figure in any direction. "Elric!" she called, no longer caring who might hear. A city watchman approached, lantern held high. "What business have you at this hour, woman?" "My son," she gasped. "A small boy. Dark hair. Have you seen him?" The watchman shook his head. "No children out tonight. Best get back inside before the night patrol comes through." For hours, Isolde searched the surrounding streets, growing increasingly desperate as the eastern sky began to lighten. Finally, as dawn broke, she returned to Marta's house, hoping against hope that Elric had somehow found his way back. The house was empty, but on the table lay something that made Isolde's blood run cold, a golden pendant shaped like a crown, inset with sapphires. Her pendant, the one she had been wearing the night of her banishment. Beside it was a scrap of parchment bearing a childish drawing of the castle's northern gate, and beneath that, in careful, deliberate letters, "She is already here." Dawn painted the castle walls a pale gold as Isolde approached the servants' entrance at the northern gate. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a reminder of the 5 years she had spent in exile. She had exchanged her rough spice seller's clothing for a servant's garb borrowed from Marta, a plain gray dress and white cap that might allow her to move through the castle unnoticed. "If you're caught," Marta had warned while helping her dress, "they won't simply banish you this time. The king's mercy has limits, even for his own blood." The warning echoed in Isolde's mind as she joined a group of kitchen servants returning from the market with baskets of vegetables and flour sacks. She kept her head down, mimicking their tired shuffle as they approached the guards. "Halt," commanded the younger guard, his beard still patchy with youth. "State your business." "Kitchen staff," mumbled the lead woman, not bothering to look up. "Lord Pharaoh and his party arrived today. Cook has us preparing since before dawn." The guard nodded, his eyes already moving past them to the next group of people approaching the gate. Isolde held her breath as she passed through the stone archway, expecting at any moment to feel a hand on her shoulder, to hear a voice cry out in recognition. But no challenge came. Inside the castle walls, Isolde broke away from the kitchen servants, slipping into a narrow corridor she had used countless times as a child to escape her tutors. The passageway, hidden behind a tapestry depicting the kingdom's founding, was thick with dust and cobwebs, suggesting it had been forgotten in her absence. The castle seemed eerily quiet. During her childhood, these halls had bustled with life. Courtiers seeking the king's favor, musicians practicing for evening entertainments, servants hurrying to fulfill the demands of noble guests. Now her footsteps echoed in empty corridors where tapestries hung faded and tattered. She paused at an intersection, momentarily disoriented. 5 years had changed the castle in subtle ways. Doorways that had once stood open were now sealed. Windows that had allowed sunlight to flood the corridors were shuttered. "Where are you, Elric?" she whispered, pressing a hand against the cold stone wall. "What brought you to this place?" Following instinct, she made her way toward the royal portrait gallery, a long hall where images of her ancestors stared down from gilded frames. As a child, she had often come here to escape the pressures of court life, finding comfort in the painted eyes that seemed to understand her loneliness. The gallery door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the few rays of light that penetrated the heavy curtains. She moved slowly down the line of portraits, stern-faced kings and serene queens who had ruled for generations before her father. Then she saw it, the empty space where her portrait had once hung. The wall showed a lighter rectangle against the surrounding stone, marking where the frame had protected the surface from years of dust. Her father had removed her image, erasing her from the royal lineage as completely as if she had never existed. The pain of this discovery was so sharp that she almost missed the sound, a faint shuffling from the far end of the gallery. She froze, pressing herself against the wall behind a heavy curtain. "Third time this week I've had to dust in here," came a woman's irritated voice. "As if anyone ever comes to look at these grim old faces." "The king's orders," replied a male voice. Every room maintained as if the princess might return any day. 5 years she's been gone," scoffed the woman. "Dead most likely, or living wild in the forests like they say. Yet we must keep her rooms fresh with flowers and turn down her bed each night. Better not let the king hear you talk so." Yesterday he dismissed a guard for saying her name too loudly. The voices faded as the servants moved to another section of the castle, but their words remained, echoing in Isolde's mind. Her father kept her rooms ready. After everything, the public humiliation, the banishment, the threats against her child, he still hoped for her return. When she was certain the servants were gone, Isolde continued through the gallery, slipping through a small door at the end that led to the royal family's private wing. These corridors were better maintained, the floors polished, and the air fresher. She passed her mother's chambers, now sealed with a black ribbon across the door, a sign of mourning. Her throat tightened at the thought of her mother dying alone, perhaps calling for the daughter who could not come to her side. Her own chambers lay just beyond, and she paused at the threshold, her hand hovering over the familiar carved oak of the door. Inside would be her childhood, the bed where she had dreamed of adventure, the window seat where she had read forbidden romance tales, the vanity where she had first noticed the changes in her body that signaled her transition from girl to woman. But Elric was not here. She could feel it as surely as she could feel her own heartbeat. Whatever had drawn him to the castle, it was not a desire to see his mother's former life. Instead, she turned toward the winding staircase that led to the castle's lower levels, to the archives and catacombs where the kingdom's secrets were stored in parchment and stone. As a child, these areas had been forbidden to her, their contents deemed unsuitable for a princess's education. But she had heard whispers of their contents, treaties signed in blood, confessions extracted under torture, maps to treasures long lost. The air grew colder as she descended, the torches spaced farther apart until she had to feel her way along the damp stone walls. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy iron door stood slightly ajar, a faint light flickering beyond. The royal archives stretched before her, a vast chamber lined with shelves that disappeared into shadows. Ancient tomes bound in leather and metal shared space with scrolls sealed with wax and ribbon. The room smelled of dust, ink, and secrets long kept. Isolde moved carefully among the shelves, guided by the distant glow of a lantern. Around a corner, she found a small table where documents had been recently disturbed. Parchments laid open, their seals broken, their contents exposed to the air for perhaps the first time in decades. She leaned closer, squinting in the dim light to make out the faded ink. The first document was a treaty, signed by her father in the early years of his reign. It granted exclusive trading rights to a consortium of foreign merchants in exchange for a substantial payment to the royal treasury. The second document was a map, showing the kingdom's most fertile farmland divided into parcels. Names had been written in the margins, not the names of local farmers or even minor nobles, but foreign merchants whose wealth had allowed them to purchase land that had fed the kingdom for generations. A third document caught her eye, a letter in her father's distinctive hand, addressed to Baron Caswick, the kingdom's treasurer. It authorized the sale of water rights from the northern rivers to the same merchant consortium, effectively giving foreign interests control over the kingdom's most precious resource. "He's sold everything," Isolde whispered, horror dawning as she understood the implications. The farmland, the water rights, the trade routes, and now the people starve while foreign merchants grow fat. Not just the merchants. Isolde whirled around, nearly knocking over the lantern. From the shadows emerged a small figure, Elric, his serious face illuminated by the golden light. "Elric!" She rushed to him, dropping to her knees to embrace his small frame. "I've been terrified. Why did you leave? How did you get in here?" "I followed the sad dreams," he said simply, his dark eyes reflecting the lantern flame. "They led me here. To the truth." "What truth? Elric, you can't wander off like that. It's dangerous." "The barons helped him," Elric interrupted, pointing to the documents. "They took gold to sign these papers, and now they plan to blame only him when the people rise up." Isolde stared at her son in disbelief. "How could you possibly know that?" Instead of answering, Elric took her hand and led her deeper into the archives, to a section where the shelves had been carved directly into the rock of the castle's foundation. Here, more recent documents were stored, correspondence between her father and the kingdom's nobles over the past 5 years. "They're planning to remove him," Elric said, his voice eerily calm. "Baron Thornfield and Baron Edric. They've called a council meeting for tomorrow. They will accuse him of madness and incompetence." As if to confirm his words, voices suddenly echoed from a nearby corridor, men speaking in the hushed tones of conspiracy. "Hide," Isolde whispered, pulling Elric behind a massive bookshelf. "Time has come," said a deep voice she recognized as Baron Thornfield's. "The king is weak, obsessed with ghosts." "What of the succession?" asked another voice. "Without the princess, the line ends with Aldemar." "A regency council," replied Thornfield, "with us at its head. The people will accept any leadership that promises food and stability." The voices grew louder as the men entered the archives, their shadows stretching across the floor in the lantern light. "And what of the rumors?" asked the second voice. "That the princess lives? That she has a child?" "Peasant superstition," scoffed Thornfield. "But if by some miracle she does live, she'll find no allies here. The king's obsession with her has driven the kingdom to ruin. No one would support her return." The men moved deeper into the archives, their voices fading as they searched for documents to support their planned coup. Isolde remained frozen, Elric's small hand clutched tightly in hers. When she was certain the barons had moved far enough away, she led Elric toward a different exit, a narrow passage used by the archive keepers to bring new documents from the upper levels. "We need to leave," she whispered. "Now." But as they reached the passage, Elric pulled away from her, his eyes fixed on something lying on a nearby table. He darted forward and returned with a stack of parchment, dozens of letters bound with faded ribbon. "What is that?" Isolde asked. "His letters," Elric replied. "To you. He writes one every day." Isolde's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon. The topmost letter was dated just 3 days earlier, the ink barely dry. "My beloved daughter," it began. "Today marks 1,825 days since I last saw your face. Forgive me for not being the father you deserved, for valuing pride over love." A sound at the far end of the chamber broke the moment. The barons were returning. Clutching the letters to her chest, Isolde grabbed Elric's hand and fled up the narrow passage, leaving behind the lantern and the evidence of their presence. They emerged in a corridor near the castle kitchens, where the bustle of servants preparing the evening meal provided cover for their disheveled appearance. Isolde tucked the letters into her bodice and straightened her cap, trying to calm her racing heart. "What now?" she asked Elric, who seemed strangely calm despite their narrow escape. Before he could answer, a servant rushed past, nearly colliding with them in his haste. "Pardon, miss," he muttered. "Must hurry. The king's steward has called for all hands. A royal messenger just arrived." "A messenger?" Isolde asked, keeping her voice casual. "From where?" "The monastery on the eastern hill," replied the servant, already moving away. "They say the king has gone there in secret, left before dawn with only his personal guard." Twilight wrapped the castle in purple shadows as Isolde slipped into Marta's small house, Elric's hand clasped tightly in hers. The former lady's maid looked up from her mending, her face etched with relief that quickly transformed to concern as she took in their appearance, clothes disheveled, faces drawn with tension. "By all the saints," Marta whispered, setting aside her work. "I feared you'd been discovered." "We nearly were," Isolde replied, guiding Elric to the hearth where a small fire provided the room's only warmth. "The castle is alive with conspiracies, Marta. The barons plan to depose my father tomorrow." Marta crossed herself. "Then God has brought you back at the hour of greatest need." Isolde said nothing, her fingers tracing the outline of the letters hidden beneath her borrowed servant's dress. Once safely inside, she had removed them from her bodice and wrapped them in a scrap of linen. Now, as Elric dozed on his pallet, exhausted from their adventure, she carefully untied the ribbon binding the stack of parchment. The letters were arranged in order, each dated meticulously in her father's precise hand. She selected one from the middle of the stack, dated 2 years after her banishment. "My beloved daughter," it began. "Today I walked the battlements and imagined I saw your figure on the horizon. It was only a farmer's daughter bringing in the sheep. But for a moment my heart leaped with such hope that when the truth became clear, I could scarcely breathe for the pain of losing you again." Isolde's vision blurred with tears as she continued reading. The letter spoke of regrets, of sleepless nights, of the growing realization that in casting out his only child, King Aldemar had destroyed not only his family, but his own capacity for wise rule. "I see now that the same pride that drove me to banish you has led me to other grievous errors," he wrote. "I have sold what was not mine to sell, the people's land, their water, their future, all to fill a void that only your forgiveness could truly heal." She selected another letter, this one from just 6 months ago. "The drought continues, and with it, the people's suffering. Baron Thornfield counsels a heavier hand, more guards, stricter penalties for those who cannot pay their taxes. But I see in his eyes a hunger that goes beyond concern for the kingdom. He and the others circle me like wolves around a wounded stag." The most recent letters revealed a man consumed by regret and paranoia, increasingly aware of the conspiracy forming around him, but too broken by grief to mount an effective defense. "I dream of you," read the final letter. "Not as the angry father who cast you out, but as the old man I have become, begging your forgiveness. When I wake, I find my pillow wet with tears I cannot recall shedding." Isolde pressed the letter to her heart, feeling the years of separation collapse like a house of cards. The father she had feared and hated for so long had been punishing himself far more severely than she ever could have. "What will you do?" Marta asked quietly, having watched the emotions play across Isolde's face as she read. "I don't know," Isolde admitted. "Part of me wants to flee, to take Elric and return to our quiet life in the village. But another part wants to save him," Marta finished for her. "Despite everything." "He's at the monastery," Isolde said, her decision forming even as she spoke the words. "I must go to him before the barons realize he's vulnerable." Marta's face grew troubled. "The eastern monastery is half a day's journey on foot, with the child in darkness. I'll find a way." Isolde began gathering their few possessions. "We'll leave at first light." But as dawn approached, bringing with it a heavy mist that blanketed the city in ghostly white, Elric woke with a start. His small body trembled as he clutched at Isolde's arm. "We must go now," he insisted, his voice tight with urgency. "He's waiting. He's afraid." There was something in her son's tone, a certainty beyond his years, that quelled any objection Isolde might have raised. Within minutes they were moving through the sleeping city, cloaked in the pre-dawn fog that rendered them nearly invisible to the few guards patrolling the streets. At the eastern gate, A stroke of fortune awaited them. A farmer's cart loaded with turnips and cabbages was just being inspected by a sleepy guard. Isolde approached the farmer, a leathery-faced man with kind eyes. "Please," she whispered, pressing 2 silver coins into his weathered palm. "My son and I need to reach the monastery." "Might we ride with your vegetables?" The man glanced at the coins, then at Elric's solemn face. Without a word, he nodded toward the back of his cart, where a space had been cleared among the cabbages. The journey through the misty countryside passed in tense silence. Isolde kept one arm around Elric, whose attention remained fixed on the road ahead, as if he could see their destination through the fog and distance. The farmer asked no questions, for which Isolde was grateful. In these troubled times, everyone had secrets best kept hidden. As the sun burned away the morning mist, the monastery came into view, a collection of stone buildings perched on a hillside, surrounded by the cultivated fields tended by the monks. The farmer stopped at the base of the hill. "This is as far as I go," he said gruffly. "Path to the gate is just there, through the apple orchard." Isolde thanked him, helping Elric down from the cart. As they began the climb toward the monastery gates, she felt a growing sense of apprehension. What would she say to her father after 5 years of exile? What could possibly bridge the chasm that had opened between them that terrible night in the Great Hall? The monastery bells rang for morning prayers as they approached the heavy wooden gates. A small wicket door opened at Isolde's knock, revealing the weathered face of an elderly monk. "What brings a woman and child to our door at this hour?" he asked, his rheumy eyes moving from Isolde to Elric with mild curiosity. "We seek an audience with the king," Isolde replied, keeping her voice steady. "I'm told he is in residence." The monk's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened slightly. "The king receives no visitors. He is here for prayer and contemplation. Please," Isolde lowered her voice, Tell him that someone from his past seeks reconciliation." The monk hesitated, then sighed. "Wait here." He closed the wicket door, leaving them standing in the shadow of the gate. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Elric stood perfectly still beside her, his small face turned up toward the monastery's tallest tower, as if he could see through stone walls to where her father waited. "He's writing," Elric said suddenly. "Another letter. But he knows this one will never be sent." Before Isolde could question this strange pronouncement, the wicket door reopened. The monk beckoned them inside with a gnarled finger. "The king will see you," he said, his voice betraying surprise. "Though I cannot imagine what business a common woman and child could have with his majesty." He led them through a series of courtyards and cloisters, the stone paths worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet. Monks moved about their morning duties, some tending gardens, others transcribing texts in the open air of the courtyard. None paid any attention to the visitors in their midst. Their guide stopped before a small wooden door set into the monastery's eastern wall. "His Majesty is at prayer in the chapel of St. Agnes," the monk explained. "You may have a few moments, no more. He is not well." With those ominous words, the monk retreated, leaving Isolde and Elric alone before the chapel door. Isolde knelt before her son, straightening his simple tunic and pushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead. "Elric," she whispered, "whatever happens in there, remember that I love you more than anything in this world. Nothing will ever change that." The boy nodded solemnly. "He needs to see you," he said simply. "He needs to know it wasn't too late." Taking a deep breath, Isolde pushed open the chapel door. The interior was dim, illuminated only by a few candles flickering before a simple stone altar. Kneeling on the hard floor before the altar was a solitary figure, a man wearing not the rich robes of kingship, but the simple brown habit of a penitent. King Aldemar, once the most powerful man in the kingdom, now looked like nothing more than an elderly monk seeking absolution. His back was bent, his shoulders hunched beneath the rough fabric of the borrowed robe. His hands, clasped in prayer, trembled visibly even from where Isolde stood. "Your Majesty," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the sacred silence of the chapel. The king did not turn immediately. For a moment, Isolde feared he had not heard her. Then, slowly, Painfully, he rose from his knees and turned to face his visitors. The years had not been kind to King Aldemar. The proud, powerful man who had once ruled with an iron will had been replaced by this hollow-eyed stranger. Deep lines carved his face like river channels, and his once dark beard had gone completely white. But it was his eyes that shocked Isolde the most. Once sharp and commanding, they now held the lost look of a man who had wandered too far into his own regrets to find his way back. Those eyes widened as they fell upon her face. The king took one stumbling step forward, then another, his lips forming words that failed to emerge. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rasp, as if he had spent years screaming into the void. "Isolde," he whispered, "or has my mind finally betrayed me completely?" "It's me, father," she replied, her own voice threatening to break. "I've come back." The king's face collapsed in a wave of emotion so raw that Isolde had to resist the urge to look away. This was not the reunion she had imagined countless times during her exile, sometimes with rage, sometimes with vindication. This was something far more devastating, the complete surrender of a once mighty soul. Aldemar fell to his knees before her, not as a king, but as a broken man. "My child," he gasped, "my only child." And then his gaze moved beyond her to where Elric stood quietly observing the scene. The king's expression transformed yet again, shock giving way to wonder to a realization that seemed to physically impact him. He swayed on his knees, one trembling hand reaching out toward the boy. "You," he breathed. "It was you all along." The chapel's stained glass windows cast pools of jeweled light across the stone floor as King Aldemar stared at Elric with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Outside, birds called to one another in the monastery gardens, oblivious to the momentous reunion taking place within these ancient walls. "The boy from my dreams," the king whispered, his weathered hand still outstretched toward Elric. "Night after night, watching me, silent, waiting." Isolde placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder, uncertainty flickering across her face. "What do you mean, father?" The king's eyes never left Elric's face. "For months now, he has come to me in dreams, standing at the foot of my bed or beside my writing desk. Never speaking, just observing. I thought I had finally descended into madness." Elric stepped forward, moving with a deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his 5-year-old frame. He reached out, placing his small hand against the king's wrinkled cheek in a gesture so tender it brought fresh tears to Aldemar's eyes. "I wasn't watching," Elric said, his voice clear in the chapel's perfect acoustics. "I was listening." "Listening?" Aldemar echoed. "To your letters," the boy explained. "To your heart breaking. To your regret." The king's eyes widened. "How could you possibly—" "I don't know how," Isolde interjected, her voice tinged with wonder and fear. "He's always been different. He didn't speak a word until 3 weeks ago, then suddenly began talking about you, about hearing you cry at night." Aldemar slowly rose to his feet, his joints creaking audibly in the silence of the chapel. He looked from the boy to Isolde, his expression haunted. "There were nights," he admitted, "when I would write to you until dawn, pouring my regrets onto parchment, knowing you would never read them. On those nights I felt a presence, as if someone were standing just behind me, reading over my shoulder." "He was," Isolde said simply. The king gestured toward a small wooden bench against the chapel wall. "Please sit with me. There is so much to say, and I fear the barons may already be looking for me." Isolde hesitated, 5 years of hurt and anger warring with the unexpected vulnerability of the man before her. Finally she nodded, guiding Elric to the bench where they sat beside the king. "I made a terrible mistake," Aldemar began, his voice steadier now. "Not just in sending you away, but in everything that followed. I allowed my pride and fear to poison my judgment. The land sales," Isolde said. "The water rights. We found the documents in the archives." Shame washed over the king's face. "After you left, I cared for nothing but my own misery. The foreign merchants came with their gold and promises, and I saw a way to fill the royal coffers without having to engage with a world that had suddenly become unbearable. And now the people starve, Isolde said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. Yes. The king accepted her judgment without defense. The merchants raised prices beyond what common folk could pay. They dammed the rivers to create private fisheries while village wells ran dry. And his voice broke. I was too lost in grief to see what I had done until it was too late. Elric, who had been watching this exchange with his unnervingly adult gaze, suddenly spoke. The dream started to change, he said. That's why we had to come now. Both Isolde and the king turned to the boy in surprise. What do you mean, child? Aldemar asked. At first I only heard your sadness, Elric explained, his small hands folded in his lap. But then I started to see other things. Men in fine clothes, plotting in dark rooms. They spoke of taking your crown, of blaming you for everything. The king nodded grimly. The barons. They've called a council meeting for tomorrow. I came here to escape their watchful eyes, to pray for guidance. A bitter laugh escaped him. After 5 years of writing letters to a daughter I believed lost forever, I finally turned to God. But it seems he had already sent me a messenger. He gazed at Elric with wonder. How is this possible? How could a child? He stopped, realization dawning on his face. He is not just any child. He is my grandson. Royal blood flows in his veins. And his father's blood, Isolde added quietly. Liam's blood. At the mention of the blacksmith, the king's expression darkened. The man I imprisoned. Is he still alive? Isolde asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she feared the answer. The king looked away. I do not know. After your departure, I ordered him held in the North Tower. I left instructions that he was to be kept alive but isolated. Then, as my grief consumed me, I simply forgot about him. Isolde's face hardened. You forgot? A man's life, my child's father, and you forgot? Isolde, the king pleaded. You cannot judge me more harshly than I have judged myself. I was blind, consumed by pride and tradition. I couldn't see that love, true love, matters more than bloodlines or political alliances. And now? Isolde challenged. What do you see now, father? The king looked at Elric, who returned his gaze with eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond their years. I see that something extraordinary has happened. This child, born of royal blood and common love, has somehow bridged the gulf between us. He has awakened something in me that I thought long dead. Compassion, Elric said simply. The king nodded slowly. Yes, compassion. Not just for you, my daughter, but for all those who have suffered under my neglect. He turned to Isolde, his eyes suddenly fierce with purpose. The foreign merchants, the greedy barons, they thought they could use my weakness to enrich themselves at the expense of our people. But they didn't count on this. He gestured to the three of them sitting together. They didn't count on redemption. As if in response to his words, the chapel door swung open. A young monk stood in the doorway, his face flushed with exertion. Your Majesty, he gasped. Riders approach. They bear the banners of Baron Thornfield and Baron Edric. The king rose, suddenly looking more like the ruler Isolde remembered from her childhood. How many? 12 armed men, sire. They demand an audience. Aldemar turned to Isolde and Elric. It seems our reunion has been discovered sooner than I hoped. The barons must have spies among the monastery servants. What will you do? Isolde asked, rising to stand beside her father. A grim smile crossed the king's face. What I should have done years ago. Face them, challenge their greed. But first, he knelt before Elric, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. Tell me, child, what do you see when you look into my heart now? Elric studied the king's face with his unsettling intensity. A broken crown, he said finally. But the pieces want to come together again. The king nodded, as if this cryptic answer made perfect sense. And do they? Come together? Elric placed his small hand on the king's chest, directly over his heart. That depends on what you do next. The chapel fell silent, save for the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. Aldemar looked from Elric to Isolde, his decision forming in the depths of his eyes. Isolde, he said, his voice taking on the commanding tone she remembered from her childhood. "Take Elric through the passage behind the altar. It leads to the monastery gardens. Brother Thomas will show you to a place where you can remain hidden until I have dealt with the barons." "No," Isolde replied firmly. "I didn't come this far to hide again." Surprise registered on the king's face, followed by a flash of the old stubbornness. But before he could protest, Elric spoke again. "We need to stay," he said with quiet certainty. "All three of us together. That's how the story changes." The king and Isolde exchanged a look, mutual recognition of the strange power this child seemed to wield. Whatever force had connected Elric to his grandfather across miles and years was still at work, guiding them toward some conclusion none of them could yet see. "Very well," the king conceded. "But stay behind me. If things go poorly, you must promise to flee." Isolde nodded, though the determined set of her jaw suggested she had no intention of abandoning her father a second time. As they moved toward the chapel door, Aldemar paused, turning back to his daughter. "There is something you should know," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "These past months, as your son visited my dreams, something began to change within me. I started to see the consequences of my actions, not just with you, but with the kingdom." "What do you mean?" "I began to undo what I could of the damage. I've been meeting secretly with village elders, opening the royal granaries to those in need. I've drafted proclamations invalidating the worst of the land sales, though I've not yet had the courage to announce them publicly." Hope flickered across Isolde's face. "So you've been helping the people in secret?" The king nodded. "The mysterious benefactor, who has been providing grain to the northern villages, medicine to the sick in the western provinces, that was royal gold, distributed through the monastery networks." He glanced at Elric. Somehow I think he knew that too. The boy's solemn expression softened into the first genuine smile Isolde had seen on his face since they entered the castle. "The sad king became a good king again," he said. "But no one knew. Until now," Aldemar said, squaring his shoulders as the sound of armored men approached the chapel. "And perhaps that is as it should be. Some truths require witnesses." He pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping out into the monastery courtyard where a dozen mounted men awaited. Their leader, Baron Thornfield, sat astride a massive black warhorse, his face darkening with surprise as he registered not only the king, but the woman and child who emerged behind him. "Your Majesty," Thornfield called, his voice dripping with false concern. "We feared for your safety when you left the castle without proper escort. The council is most anxious for your return." "I'm certain they are," Aldemar replied, his voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising strength. "Just as I am certain you've spent the morning rehearsing the speech with which you plan to depose me." Murmurs rippled through the baron's men. Thornfield's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "And who?" he demanded, his eyes fixing on Isolde with dangerous intensity. "Is this woman who stands so familiarly at your side?" The king straightened to his full height, the morning sun catching the silver in his beard and lending him a momentary majesty. "Baron Thornfield," he announced, his voice ringing with formal authority. "May I present my daughter, Princess Isolde, returned from exile." His hand came to rest on Elric's shoulder. "And my grandson, Prince Elric, heir to the throne of our kingdom." A stunned silence fell over the monastery courtyard. Baron Thornfield's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and calculation before settling into a practiced mask of diplomatic concern. Behind him, his men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, exchanging uncertain glances. "Princess Isolde," Thornfield finally said, inclining his head in a shallow bow that held more mockery than respect. "Returned from the dead, it seems. How providential that you should appear at precisely the moment when the kingdom faces its greatest crisis." "I assure you, Baron," Isolde replied, her voice carrying the quiet dignity she had developed during her years of exile. "Providence had little to do with it." The Baron's eyes narrowed as they moved to Elric, who stood unflinching beneath the man's scrutiny. "And this child? You claim he is your heir, your Majesty? The offspring of a princess and a common blacksmith?" He made no attempt to hide the contempt in his voice. King Aldemar stepped forward, placing himself between the mounted baron and his family. "I claim nothing, Thornfield. I simply state what is. This is my grandson, born of my blood and that of a man whose only crime was to love beyond his station. His voice took on an edge of steel. A crime for which I now see there should be no punishment. Murmurs rippled through the courtyard. Several monks had emerged from their chambers, drawn by the confrontation unfolding in their sanctuary. Among them, the elderly abbot watched with shrewd eyes, his gnarled hands clasped before him. "How touching," Thornfield sneered. "Unfortunately, Your Majesty, the council has already convened. The lords of the realm await your presence to discuss matters of grave importance, including the succession." He gestured toward the castle visible on the distant horizon. "Shall we escort you back, or do you prefer to continue this family reunion?" Before the king could respond, Elric stepped forward. Though small beside the mounted men, something in his presence commanded attention. The courtyard fell silent as the boy gazed up at Baron Thornfield with those unsettlingly ancient eyes. "You sold the northern rivers," Elric said, his clear voice echoing against the stone walls. 3,000 gold pieces. You kept half and gave the rest to Baron Edric and Lord Fairfax." The color drained from Thornfield's face. "What nonsense is this?" he blustered, though his hand instinctively moved to the sword at his hip. "The eastern fields, too," Elric continued, unperturbed. "The foreign merchants paid you in silver bars. You buried them beneath the rose garden at your summer estate." A ripple of unease passed through Thornfield's men. One of the younger knights crossed himself, muttering a prayer against witchcraft. "Silence this brat," Thornfield hissed, his composure cracking. "He speaks treason and slander." "Does he?" The abbot's voice cut through the tension as he stepped forward, his simple brown robe a stark contrast to the baron's rich velvet and gold chains. "Or does he speak truth that has long festered in darkness?" The old man turned to the assembled monks. "Brothers, fetch the record box from my chambers, the one bearing the royal seal." As two young monks hurried to obey, Thornfield's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "This is absurd. Your Majesty, we have indulged this charade long enough. The council awaits, and there are matters of state that cannot be delayed by children's fantasies." "You speak of state matters with such concern, Baron," King Aldemar observed, a new strength in his bearing. "Yet I wonder if your true concern is for the people or for your own coffers." He turned to Isolde. "My daughter spent 5 years living among those who suffer most from the drought and the foreign merchants' greed. Perhaps the council would benefit from her perspective." Thornfield's face darkened with rage. "You would invite a disgraced woman to address the lords of the realm? A woman who abandoned her duties for a commoner's bed?" "I abandoned nothing," Isolde's voice cut like a blade through the baron's bluster. "I was cast out for loving truly rather than politically. And in that exile, I learned what you and your fellow lords have forgotten, that a kingdom is not its castle or its crown, but its people." The monks returned, carrying between them an ornate wooden chest bearing the royal seal. The abbot accepted it with a reverent nod before turning to the king. "Your Majesty, for 3 years, I have kept these records as you requested. Documents of every secret meeting, every corrupt bargain, every betrayal committed by those who swore to serve the realm." Understanding dawned on Thornfield's face, followed quickly by fear. "This is treason," he sputtered. "Guards, seize them." But his men remained motionless, their loyalty visibly wavering as they witnessed the unfolding scene. The youngest knight actually backed his horse away from the baron, shaking his head in refusal. "Your men won't help you," Elric said matter-of-factly. "They have families in the villages you starved, cousins who lost farms to the foreign merchants, children who drink from poisoned wells." As if summoned by the boy's words, more figures appeared at the monastery gates. Villagers in rough homespun, farmers with calloused hands, mothers with hollow-cheeked children clinging to their skirts. They flowed into the courtyard like a silent tide, forming a circle around the confrontation. "What is this?" Thornfield demanded, his horse prancing nervously as the crowd pressed closer. "The people you forgot," King Aldemar replied simply. "The true power of any kingdom." A weathered farmer stepped forward from the crowd, bowing awkwardly to the king. "Your Majesty, word spread through the villages that you were here, that you'd been helping us in secret all these months." He glanced at Isolde with a flicker of recognition. and that the princess had returned. Isolde's eyes widened in surprise. Among the gathered villagers, she spotted familiar faces. A woman whose child she had delivered during a difficult birth, an old man whose roof she had helped repair before winter. People from every village where she had sought refuge during her years of exile. "How did you know?" she asked. The farmer gestured toward Elric. "The boy told us. Not with words, mind you, but in dreams. Been happening for weeks now. Dreams of returning to the monastery today." He shrugged apologetically. "Thought I was going mad until I heard my neighbor had the same dream. Then the whole village." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Dozens of heads nodded, confirming this impossible story. King Aldemar looked down at his grandson with renewed wonder. "What are you?" he whispered, too softly for others to hear. Elric smiled, a genuine child's smile that momentarily banished the ancient wisdom from his eyes. "Just a boy," he answered. "Who can hear hearts?" The king squared his shoulders and addressed the assembled crowd. "People of the realm, I have failed you. In my grief and pride, I allowed greedy men to steal what was rightfully yours: land, water, hope." His voice grew stronger with each word. "Today, that changes. Today, we reclaim our kingdom." He turned to Baron Thornfield, who sat rigid with fury upon his warhorse. "You may return to the castle, Baron, and inform the council that the king will join them shortly. Tell them to prepare for significant changes, beginning with the nullification of all foreign land contracts and the restoration of water rights to the common people." "This is madness," Thornfield hissed. "The merchants will never allow—" "The merchants answer to the crown," Aldemar interrupted. "Not the other way around. A truth I had forgotten until my grandson reminded me." He gestured to the gathered villagers. "These people are the lifeblood of our kingdom. Their welfare comes before gold or political alliances." Thornfield's face contorted with rage and fear. With a sudden jerk, he drew his sword, the steel flashing in the morning light. "I will not be undone by an old fool, a woman, and a witch child," he roared, spurring his horse directly toward the king. Several things happened at once. The villagers surged forward with angry shouts. The king's hand moved to a dagger hidden in his robes. Isolde reached for Elric, pulling him against her protectively. But before anyone could intervene, Thornfield's horse reared unexpectedly, throwing the Baron from his saddle. He crashed to the stone courtyard with a sickening crack, his sword clattering uselessly beside him. When he tried to rise, his right leg buckled beneath him, drawing a howl of pain. In the sudden silence that followed, all eyes turned to Elric, who stood calmly beside his mother, his expression serene. "You won't need your sword anymore," the boy said simply. With the Baron neutralized, his men quickly surrendered, some even dismounting to kneel before the king in renewed fealty. The abbot directed monks to bind Thornfield's broken leg and place him under guard until the king determined his fate. As order was restored to the courtyard, Isolde approached her father, Elric still at her side. "What now?" she asked quietly. King Aldemar looked out over the gathered crowd, nobles and peasants, monks and soldiers, all waiting for his next command. For the first time in 5 years, purpose shone in his eyes. "Now," he said, "we rebuild, but not as before." He turned to Isolde. "I would have you return to the castle, not as the princess who left, but as something more. The people trust you. They've seen you live among them, suffer with them, work alongside them." Isolde shook her head. "I don't want the throne, father. I never did." "Not the throne," Aldemar clarified. "Something more valuable, a voice for those who have none." He gestured to the villagers who had traveled miles to stand with them against corruption. "These people need an advocate within the castle walls. Someone who understands their struggles because she has lived them." Understanding dawned in Isolde's eyes. "A new council," she said. "Not just lords and barons, but representatives from the villages, from the trades, from those who work the land and fish the rivers." The king nodded, a smile breaking through his weathered features. "Yes, a council of all voices, with you to lead them." He looked down at Elric, who watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. "And with this extraordinary child to remind us all what truly matters." The weeks that followed transformed the kingdom. The king, revitalized by his daughter's return and his grandson's mysterious gifts, instituted sweeping reforms. Foreign contracts were renegotiated, water rights restored to villages, and grain from royal stores distributed to those in greatest need. True to her word, Isolde refused the trappings of royalty. Instead, she established a new chamber within the castle where villagers could bring their concerns directly to those in power. Under her guidance, a council of common folk, farmers, blacksmiths, midwives, and merchants, began to shape policies alongside the traditional nobles. Elric, meanwhile, became a living symbol of reconciliation. His presence in the castle, with his commoner's blood and royal bearing, bridged worlds that had long been separate. The boy still spoke rarely, but when he did, even the most stubborn barons found themselves listening. King Aldemar, already weakened by years of grief and neglect, did not live to see all their reforms take root. He died peacefully that winter, with Isolde at his bedside and Elric holding his hand. His final letter, unlike the hundreds that had preceded it, was not addressed to his daughter, but to future generations. History will judge us harshly as it should. I was a king who forgot that true power lies not in gold or armies, but in justice and compassion. My redemption came not through my own wisdom, but through the love I nearly destroyed. May those who follow remember what I forgot, that a kingdom's strength is measured not by its walls, but by the welfare of its weakest citizen. After the king's passing, Isolde returned to Eldrath with Elric, honoring her promise to visit the castle regularly to guide the new council. They lived not as royalty, but as ordinary villagers, albeit ones whose story had become legend throughout the realm. The tale of the banished princess and her remarkable son spread far beyond the kingdom's borders. Bards sang of the silent child who heard the cries of a king's heart, of a woman who found strength in exile, of a kingdom reborn through forgiveness and vision. And though Isolde never wore a crown, she reigned in the hearts of the people as surely as any queen who had come before her. Her true legacy, however, was not in songs or stories, but in the changed lives of countless subjects who no longer starved or thirsted in the shadow of a distant castle. For Elric, the dreams eventually faded as he grew into a young man whose wisdom needed no supernatural enhancement. Yet sometimes, on quiet nights, villagers would still report dreams of a boy with ancient eyes, walking silently through their homes, listening to the unspoken fears and hopes they carried in their hearts. In the end, it wasn't royal blood or ancient tradition that saved a kingdom on the brink of collapse. It was forgiveness. Isolde's journey from pampered princess to resilient survivor taught her that true strength lies not in titles or castles, but in the courage to rebuild what's broken. And King Aldemar discovered, through the innocent wisdom of a child, that pride is a poor substitute for love. What would you have done in Isolde's place? Could you have found the strength to return and face the father who cast you out, or would bitterness have consumed your heart? Perhaps the most powerful lesson in this tale is that sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected sources. A silent child with mysterious gifts became the bridge between worlds that seemed forever separated. In our own lives, we too may find that reconciliation arrives in forms we never anticipated, if only we have the wisdom to recognize it. The walls we build, whether of stone or pride or fear, can always be dismantled, brick by brick, by the power of compassion and understanding. If this story touched your heart, remember that you too have the power to forgive what seems unforgivable, to rebuild what appears shattered beyond repair. Every kingdom, whether a nation or simply the territory of your own heart, can be transformed by the courage to begin again. Share this tale with someone who needs to hear it, leave your thoughts below, and stay with us for more stories that remind us of the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit.